All right, let's dive into another deep dive. Today we're tackling some seriously tricky climate change misconceptions. The kind of stuff that might even make you go, wait, do I actually have this right?
It is really wild how easily our assumptions can stray from the actual data, especially with something as important as this.
Totally. And to help us sort through it all, we've got a whole stack of findings from Gapminder. That awesome nonprofit that uses data and research to debunk global misconceptions.
Yeah, they're great.
And get this, they've surveyed people worldwide, and the results are, well, pretty surprising, to say the least.
Definitely eye-opening.
Big time. For example, what do you think happens to the average global temperature if we could, snap our fingers and cut CO2 emissions in half today?
I think a lot of people would guess it goes down. Or yeah, at least stays the same.
Right. Seems logical.
But it's a little more complicated than that.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Lay it on me. To the real story.
Well, the temperature would actually keep rising for decades, even with that huge cut. It really comes down to how CO2 behaves in our atmosphere. It's not a quick fix.
So even if we slam the brakes on emissions, we're still in for some warming. I'm guessing this is where that CO2 persists thing comes in, right? The stuff I keep hearing about.
Exactly. Think of it like a bathtub, all right? But like a really messed up bathtub.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
So we keep adding CO2, like turning the faucet on full blast. But the drain, the thing that gets rid of it, it's tiny. It represents the natural processes that remove CO2, and they just can't keep up.
I see. So even if we cut the flow from the faucet in half, the tub's still filling up, and the temperature keeps rising because the drain's so small.
Precisely.
Okay, that bathtub analogy is pretty powerful. So basically, it's not enough to just slow down the CO2 faucet. We need to, shut it off completely.
Yeah, and ideally find a way to make that drain work a whole lot faster.
And that, in the real world, means
reaching net zero emissions. That's the goal, where we're removing as much CO2 from the atmosphere as we're putting in. A huge challenge, no question. But if we want to stabilize things, it's crucial.
Gotcha. So cutting emissions is essential. It's step one. But then we've got to get to net zero, and fast. Now, here's another one that tripped a lot of people up in Gapminder's survey. Quick quiz. Which of these is not a greenhouse gas? Water vapor, nitrogen, or ozone?
Ooh, tricky. That would be nitrogen.
Right. And this is where things get interesting, because there's a lot of confusion around water vapor's role in all of this.
A lot of confusion.
I've even heard some folks try to use it to downplay human-caused climate change. Hey, if water vapor is already a bigger greenhouse gas, why worry so much about CO2? But I'm guessing it's not that simple.
Not at all. Water vapor is a major greenhouse gas, for sure. And it's essential for life on Earth as we know it. But here's the thing. The amount of water vapor in the atmosphere is directly related to temperature.
So as we release more CO2, things heat up.
More water evaporates, exactly, adding to the greenhouse effect.
So it's not an either-or situation. CO2 is driving the warming, and the water vapor is basically making the whole thing accelerate even faster.
That's a good way to put it.
This brings us to another interesting point from Gapminder. How much of the excess heat from global warming do you think actually gets absorbed by the oceans?
Ooh, this is a big one.
It is.
Prepare yourself. It's a whopping 89%.
Wait, seriously? 89%? I never would have guessed that high. But if that's the case, why aren't we feeling the heat more already? Things are definitely getting warmer, but 89% seems like it should be, I don't know, hotter.
Yeah, good point. It has to do with how water stores heat compared to air. Water has a much higher heat capacity, meaning it takes a lot more energy to raise its temperature. Imagine trying to heat a small pot of water on the stove versus a whole swimming pool. It's going to take a lot longer to heat up that pool, right?
Okay, I get that. So
Yeah.
the oceans are acting like this giant heat sink, kind of slowing down how quickly things warm up, which is good, I guess.
Good in that it's buying us some time. But here's the flip side. All that stored heat will eventually be released back into the atmosphere. So even if we magically stopped all greenhouse gas emissions today, we'd still see warming from the oceans for centuries.
Wow. Talk about long-term consequences. It really drives home the point that the decisions we make today have a real impact on the future. Okay, so we've talked emissions, we've talked heat absorption. What about public perception? Gapminder asked people in high-income countries if they saw climate change as a threat in the next 20 years. What do you think?
It's probably higher than most people think. It's about 80%.
Really? 80%? That's surprising given how much disagreement we see in the media. All those stories about climate deniers and folks downplaying the risks.
Right, but it's important to remember that the loudest voices don't necessarily represent the majority. The data shows that most people, even in wealthier countries, do recognize the threat.
Which I guess is a good sign, right? Means there's at least a basis for some kind of collective action.
It's definitely a hopeful sign.
Okay, let's tackle another common misconception, this time about rising sea levels.
Mm.
What percentage of the global population do you think lives less than 5 meters above sea level?
Most people way overestimate this. The real number is closer to 11%.
Oh, wow. So it's still a lot of people, but a lot less than I would have thought. Why is it so important to have accurate data here, though? Is it about avoiding panic, like the sky is falling kind of thing?
Exactly. When we overestimate the number of people at risk, it can lead to this feeling of helplessness, like, oh, the problem's just too big, we can't do anything.
Right.
But understanding the true scale, that helps us focus on solutions and on getting help to those who are most vulnerable.
Makes sense. Okay, let's get a bit more technical for a second, Gapminder asked. Compared to the incoming solar energy that hits Earth, how much less energy leaves our planet each year? What do you think?
Interesting.
It's a tricky one.
It's actually a tiny amount, only about 0.3%.
Hold on, just 0.3%. That seems like almost nothing. How can such a small difference cause so much warming?
It's all about the cumulative effect. Think about adding a blanket to your bed. It might only trap a little bit of extra heat, but over time, you get warmer and warmer. Same idea here. Even that small difference in energy sustained over years, it adds up. Big time.
So even tiny changes in that balance can have massive consequences. Okay, last one for now. Let's get back down to Earth, literally. What percentage of the world's fresh water do you think we use for agriculture?
Ooh, I know this one trips people up.
It does.
It's a lot more than you might think, something like 70%.
70%. Seriously. Wow. I knew it was a lot, but that's crazy. Really makes you think about what we eat and how it impacts water.
It does. We talked about saving water at home, shorter showers and all that, which is important, but
Yeah.
agriculture just dwarfs everything else when it comes to water consumption.
So what we put on our plate has a huge impact on water resources. Food for thought, quite literally.
Yeah.
But hey, not everything is doom and gloom. Remember that 80% figure from before? The people in high-income countries who see climate change as a threat.
Right.
That's a pretty decent base for collective action.
Absolutely. It's easy to get caught up in the negativity, but that statistic shows a good level of awareness, of concern. It gives me hope.
Hope for change.
Yeah, that we can build on that, build a wider consensus.
Totally. And what about that sea level rise misconception? The fact that the actual percentage of people living near the coast is lower than many assume? What's the key takeaway there?
It's about pushing back against that feeling of helplessness. The problem's just too big to solve.
Right.
When we understand the real scale of things, it helps us focus on practical solutions, on actually supporting those who are most vulnerable.
It's about empowerment through knowledge, basically.
Exactly.
And even that small 0.3% difference in Earth's energy balance, it really shows that even small changes over time could have a huge impact.
Absolutely. It really highlights how delicate the balance of our planet systems really is.
So, big picture, what would you say are the most important things for our listeners to take away from all of this? Like if we could distill it down to a few key points.
Well, first, climate change is it's complex, it's interconnected. We need to think bigger than simple solutions. Think about systems, how everything fits together.
Right, so it's not just about cutting emissions. It's about understanding the role of the oceans, what we eat, how what we do today affects the future.
Exactly. Second point. The data can be heavy, for sure, but it can also be empowering. We're not helpless in all of this.
Knowledge is power, right? And clearly, more and more people are getting informed, getting concerned. Even folks who aren't necessarily, on the front lines of climate activism.
Right, and that leads to the third big takeaway. We need to work together. Collective action across sectors, across borders, that's what's going to make a difference.
It's not about finger pointing. It's about finding solutions that actually work.
Yeah, and that includes engaging with businesses, with corporations, that 60% figure, the companies acknowledging climate risk.
Right.
It's a sign that the business world is starting to wake up to the reality of this.
And as we were talking about earlier, it's not just about altruism, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're realizing that climate change is a real threat to their business, to their bottom line.
Exactly. And that, honestly, that gives me a lot of hope. That self-interest and sustainability are starting to align.
Well, I don't know about you, but I feel like we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive. I'm already feeling like I need to rethink some of my assumptions, which is a good thing.
It is. That's what this is all about. Using data to challenge our thinking, to see the world more clearly, And that's just the beginning. It never ceases to amaze me how, even when we think we're pretty informed, data can reveal these little gaps in our understanding.
Totally. So thinking back on all the misconceptions we've talked about, what stands out to you as the most unexpected, the one that really made you go, wait, really?
For me, it's got to be the fact that even if we cut CO2 emissions in half today, like right now, the warming wouldn't just stop. It really hits home how long-lasting the impact of those emissions truly is.
Yeah, that one's a real head scratcher. And that bathtub analogy, it's stuck with me. It's a pretty stark visual, right? Like we've already set some pretty significant warming in motion.
Definitely. And then there's that statistic about the oceans absorbing 89% of the excess heat. It's mind-blowing when you think about it, the sheer amount of energy they're soaking up.
Makes you appreciate the power of nature, for sure. But also, you realize the kind of pressure we're putting on these systems.
Oh, absolutely. And it highlights how everything's connected, right? We can't just look at the atmosphere on its own. What happens in the oceans affects the whole planet.
Speaking of interconnectedness, that statistic about how much fresh water we use for agriculture was pretty eye-opening, too.
70%. Right.
70%.
Yeah.
Hard to wrap your head around that.
It really challenges how we think about water use, doesn't it? Makes you think twice about our food systems,
Yeah.
how to make them more sustainable.
Yeah, food for thought, literally. But hey, let's not forget some of the positives we talked about, like that 80% figure. The people in high-income countries who see climate change as a real threat,
Oh, right, right.
that's a pretty solid base to build on in terms of taking action.
Sure, sure. It's easy to get lost in the doom and gloom sometimes, but that shows there's a good level of awareness, of concern. Gives me hope that we can create change.
Absolutely. Now, about that sea level rise misconception, the actual percentage of people living close to sea level is way lower than many assume. What's the key takeaway there?
It's about avoiding that feeling of helplessness, like, oh, it's too big a problem, we can't do anything.
Right.
When we understand the real scale of things, it helps us focus on practical solutions and on getting help to those who really need it.
Empowerment through knowledge.
Right.
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 And what about that 0.3% difference in Earth's energy balance? It really shows how even these small changes over time can have a massive effect.
It does. It's a reminder of how finely tuned our planet systems are and how our actions can throw things off.
Okay, so big picture. What would you say are the most important things for our listeners to remember? Like if we could boil it all down to a few key points.
All right. Well, first off, climate change is complex. It's all connected. We need to think bigger, move beyond simple solutions, think about systems, the whole picture.
Right. So it's not just about cutting emissions. It's about understanding the oceans, what we eat, how today's actions affect the future.
Exactly. Second point. Yeah, the data can be tough, but it can also be empowering. We're not helpless in all of this.
Knowledge is power, as they say. And it seems like more and more people are becoming aware, becoming concerned, even those who aren't, diehard climate activists.
That's true. And that brings us to point number 3. Collective action is crucial. We have to work together on this across all sectors, across borders. That's what's going to make a difference.
So it's not about placing blame. It's about finding solutions that work for everyone.
Yeah, and part of that is engaging with businesses, with corporations. Remember that 60% figure, the companies acknowledging climate risk? It's a good sign. The business world's starting to wake up to what's happening.
And as we were discussing, it's not purely out of the goodness of their hearts, right? They're seeing that climate change is a real threat to their business.
Right. And that, honestly, that's encouraging to see that self-interest and sustainability are starting to, come together.
It's about time. Right?
Yeah. So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to ask our listeners, what really resonated with you? What new insights did you gain? What questions are still out there?
And most importantly, what are you going to do with this knowledge?
Will you dig a little deeper, challenge your own assumptions, use your voice to push for change? We've given you the tools. Now it's time to use them.
The future depends on it. It's kind of a relief to realize that we can actually make a difference, even with small actions, right?
It really is. I think it's easy to get overwhelmed by the sheer scale of climate change. But everything helps. Every step we take, whether it's reducing our own carbon footprint or pushing for bigger changes.
And it's not all on individuals, right? Like we talked about, even corporations are starting to see climate change as a risk, a financial risk.
Yeah.
That 60% figure was pretty telling.
Yeah. What's interesting there is that it's not just about ethics anymore or social responsibility. They're seeing climate change as a real threat to their business, their operations, their profits even.
So it's like doing the right thing is actually becoming good business sense.
Exactly, which is why I think it's so important to work with businesses on this, you know? They have resources, they can innovate, they have a lot of influence.
For sure. It's great that more companies are stepping up, taking responsibility, but
Right.
we can't just take their word for it, right? We need to hold them accountable.
Absolutely. Greenwashing is a real thing, and we need to make sure these promises actually turn into action, into measurable results.
Transparency is key. Consumers are getting smarter about these things, They want more than just words. They want to see real change.
That's a good thing. When people make choices with their wallets, when they support businesses that are actually walking the walk, that sends a powerful message.
So awareness and action go hand in hand. The more we understand, the better choices we can make as consumers, as citizens, as people who want to make a difference.
Couldn't agree more. Knowledge is where it starts. The more we understand about this incredibly complex issue, the better equipped we are to work together to create a better future.
Well, this deep dive has definitely given me a lot to think about. We've busted some myths, looked at some really surprising data, and hopefully gotten folks a little more curious about all of this.
It's always inspiring to see people engage with this issue, to be willing to learn and grow. It gives me hope, honestly. Hope
Yeah.
that we can tackle this together.
Me too. And, you don't need to be a scientist or a politician to make a difference. Every little bit counts. Every action, no matter how small, it all contributes to building a better future. So stay curious, stay informed, and most importantly, stay engaged.
Keep asking questions, keep challenging assumptions, and don't underestimate the power of your voice.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.